9:47 at night. 47th floor, Whitaker Capitol. Elena Whitaker drew her father's Mont Blanc pen from her jacket. The Chapter 11 filing sat before her 40 years of legacy, about to die in 2 signatures. She lowered the pen toward the first line. A voice came from behind. "Ma'am, you missed this number." Not the CFO, not the lawyers. A black man in a janitor's uniform, hand trembling, eyes steady, holding out a single sheet. A billion-dollar system wrong because of one number, or was the only man who saw the truth the one nobody ever looked at? 6 o'clock came to the 47th floor the way it always did, by way of the long shadows stretching across Lake Michigan and falling through the glass of Elena Whitaker's office. She sat with her back to the water, which was something she had trained herself to do years ago. Views were a distraction. Numbers were not. On her desk sat 2 objects. The first was a framed photograph from the 2001 IPO, in which a much younger Elena stood beside her father Harold at the New York Stock Exchange, both of them holding the closing bell with the grave pride of people who believed in what they had built. The second was a dark lacquered fountain pen with a small white star on the cap the Mont Blanc Harold had given her the day she finished her MBA. She had not realized until tonight that she had been saving it for this. She turned the pen slowly between her fingers. Anyone who had worked with her long enough knew that when the pen began to rotate, she was either thinking or trying not to. The television on her far wall was muted, but the red banner crawling across CNBC did not need sound. Whitaker Capital to file. Chapter 11. Sources confirm. The crawler looped every 11 seconds. She had counted. She lifted the framed photograph and placed it face down gently, like laying a person into a coffin. "I'm sorry, Dad," she said to the back of the frame. "I trusted the numbers, just like you taught me." Her voice came out steadier than she expected, which somehow made it worse. For 20 years, she had spent every working hour turning herself into something nobody could accuse of sentimentality. They had called her Harold's daughter, when she started some with affection, some with a smirk, and she had answered with balance sheets and cost ratios and midnight emails until the phrase meant nothing anymore. She had made herself into a woman of logic the way her father had made himself into a man of granite. Tonight, logic was telling her to sign away his life. 3 stories below her, in a concrete locker room that smelled of bleach and stale coffee, Dennis Bell was unfolding a sandwich. It had been wrapped in a paper towel by his 8-year-old daughter Zoe, who had pressed the edges flat with the seriousness of a surgeon and written "Daddy" on the top in a green marker that was almost out of ink. Beside the sandwich, tucked inside his backpack, was a single sheet of lined paper with 10 long division problems and a handwritten note at the top in the same green ink. "For Daddy, check my math, please." Dennis smiled and slid the page into the breast pocket of his uniform shirt. Then he opened the FaceTime app on his phone. His daughter's face appeared with her hair half braided, her grandmother visible in the background, working quietly over a bowl of greens. "Daddy, did you get my homework?" "Got it right here, baby. You want me to check it now?" Zoe nodded so hard her braids swung. He held up the page and ran his eyes down the column. 8 of the 10 were correct. Number 6 was wrong. She had carried a 2 when she should have carried a 3. He considered telling her, then changed his mind. "Number 6, you sure about that one?" "I'm sure." "Check it again, every step, out loud." She did. Halfway through, her face fell. "Oh, there it is? I messed up." "You fixed it. That's different." He leaned closer to the screen. "Zoe, listen to me. Always check every number, even when everybody tells you you're right, especially when everybody tells you you're right." She rolled her eyes the way only an 8-year-old can with love. "Yes, Daddy. I love you. Tell Grandma I said good night." He hung up and slid the phone into his locker. When he turned around, his coworker Ray was standing behind him with 2 mugs of coffee and an expression of long-suffering amusement. "Man, I don't know why you do that," Ray said. "Do what?" "Read your little girl's math like it's the federal budget, because one day it's going to be somebody's federal budget." Ray snorted and handed him a mug. The 2 men had been cleaning the building together for 3 years. long enough for Ray to know that Dennis sometimes picked up finance reports off the trash carts and read them on his break. "Why you always got your nose in them papers anyway?" Ray asked. "You ain't getting overtime for that." Dennis took a sip of the coffee, which was burnt as it always was. "Almost became an accountant once. 1 semester short. Now I read to miss the work. That's the saddest hobby I ever heard." "Could be worse. Could be golf." Ray laughed. The two men pushed their carts toward the service elevator, and Dennis pressed the button for the 32nd floor. His rounds always started low and worked up. The top, the 47th, he saved for the end of the night. There was usually coffee up there. The board meeting began at 7 o'clock sharp. By 7:15, everyone in the conference room had already accepted how it was going to end. Chief Financial Officer Richard Moreau stood at the head of the long table with his tailored jacket off and his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows, a performance of effort he had been perfecting since his Wharton days. He walked the board through the numbers with the slow, regretful cadence of a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. The European expansion had bled faster than the most pessimistic model predicted. The hedge book had unwound badly. The balance sheet had crossed the line from distressed to insolvent sometime in the second week of September and had been deteriorating ever since. Two partners from the firm's Big Four auditor confirmed every figure. A woman from the restructuring law firm sat beside Elena with a leather portfolio open to the pages that would need her signature. At 9:25, Richard closed his binder and spoke quietly. "Elena, the only responsible course of action is Chapter 11. Tonight, before the Asian markets deteriorate any further." Everyone in the room turned to look at her. She heard her father's voice inside her head, the way she always did in rooms like this one. "The numbers don't lie, Elena. Trust the data. Proceed with the filing," she said. The room exhaled. The lawyer slid a neat stack of documents toward her. Richard closed his laptop with the particular gentleness of a man who had just been spared. Chairs scraped back. Coats came off the backs of chairs. By 9:31, the room had emptied, and Elena was alone with 40 years of her family's name. She did not pick up the pen yet. She stepped through the side door onto the small executive balcony, closed it behind her, and let the cold October wind push the hair back from her face. She dialed her personal attorney, not her corporate one, and asked him a single question about liability and her father's estate. When he finished answering, she said thank you in a voice that did not shake, and then she stood at the railing for almost 4 minutes and did not cry, though something in her throat worked very hard to make her. When she came back inside, she did not notice the cleaning cart parked against the wall. Dennis had pushed that cart into the boardroom at 9:38, assuming as he always did at this hour that the room was empty. He had been clearing cups, 3 half-finished lattes, and a water glass with lipstick on the rim when his eye caught on the stack of papers at the head of the table. He did not mean to read. He never did. But the top page of the stack was a financial summary annotated in a tight, aggressive hand that Dennis had come to recognize as Richard Moreau's. The man threw away 7 pages of edits a day, always in that same sharp pencil. One line in the middle of the page hooked Dennis's eye and would not let it go. FX hedge adjustment, Whitaker Europe, $34.2 million loss. He set down the water glass. He had seen that line before, not as a loss, as a gain. The previous Tuesday, emptying recycling on the 32nd floor, he had lifted a stack of printouts from the desk of Sarah Keller, the FX analyst who printed everything because she reviewed with a pen. The top sheet had been a weekly hedge summary for Whitaker Europe. That same trade had been listed as a $34.2 million gain. He remembered the figure because it was unusually round. He remembered it also because of the yellow sticky note Sarah had left in the margin. 3 words underlined twice. Best trade ever. Dennis turned the page slowly. Then he turned it again. On page 47, the consolidation sheet where all the international subsidiaries were rolled into the parent company's books, the same line item appeared again. Whitaker Europe, FX hedge, $34.2 million loss. The same trade, counted twice, on the wrong side of the ledger both times. A number moved in his head that felt like a weight dropping through a floor. 34 plus 34. $68 million of loss that, if he was reading this right, did not exist. He stood very still in the empty boardroom and felt his pulse in the back of his neck. He had been a janitor in this building for 6 years. He knew the unspoken rules of the job the way he knew the weight of his own keys. You did not touch. You did not read. You did not speak. If a man in Dennis's uniform carried a piece of paper out of a room like this one, he carried it the way a man carries a lit match into a gas station. He reached into his breast pocket and took out his daughter's math homework. "For Daddy, check my math, please." He looked at it for a long moment, then at the financial summary, then at his own reflection in the dark window above the lake. If he was wrong, he would lose his job by morning. Zoe would lose her Wednesday pediatric checkup next month because the insurance was tied to the W-2. If he was right and nobody listened, he would still lose his job. If he was right and somebody listened, he had no idea what happened then, because it had never happened in any room he had ever stood in. But if he walked out of this building tonight without saying anything, he would have to look at his daughter across the breakfast table tomorrow morning and know that he had told her to always check the number, and then when his own turn came, he had put the paper down and walked away. He folded Zoe's homework back into his pocket. He lifted the financial summary off the stack. He turned toward the door of the boardroom just as it opened. Elena Whitaker stepped back into the room. She walked without looking up to her chair at the head of the table. She sat down. She drew the Mont Blanc from her jacket and uncapped it with a small practiced twist of her wrist. She lowered the pen toward the first line of the document. Dennis stepped out from behind the cart. His hand was trembling. His eyes were not. "Ma'am, you missed this number." Elena's pen hung over the paper for what felt like a very long time. She raised her eyes slowly, the way a person raises them at a sound she is not yet ready to identify. A black man in a blue custodial uniform stood 3 steps from his cleaning cart, holding a single sheet of paper, the way a man holds something that has already cost him more than he could afford. "Where is security?" she said. Her voice was not loud. It was the voice she used in rooms where she did not need to be loud. Dennis did not move. "Ma'am, I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to read the line. You are standing in my boardroom after hours with company documents in your hand. Do you understand what that looks like?" "Yes, ma'am. It looks like a man who should have minded his own business." There was a small black phone in the corner of the boardroom. Elena could reach it in 3 steps. She did not reach for it. She looked at him again. There was something in the way he was holding the paper, not aggressive, not pleading, just waiting, that she had seen exactly twice before in her life. Both times the man holding that stillness had been her father. Both times her father had been right. "Sit down," she said. "Ma'am, sit down, Mr. Bell, Dennis Bell. Sit down, Mr. Bell, and do not move." She walked to the phone and called Richard Moreau back up from the lobby. The CFO came through the boardroom door at 9:58 with his jacket back on and his expression halfway between confusion and fury. The restructuring attorney trailed behind him with her leather portfolio tucked under one arm. 2 members of building security stood just outside in the hallway, called up by Richard on his way back to the elevator. Richard stopped when he saw Dennis sitting at the far end of the boardroom table. "Elena." He said her name the way a man says the name of a colleague he intends to save from herself. "What is this?" "This is Mr. Bell. He has a question about page 47. Richard crossed the room without looking at Dennis. He placed both hands on the back of a chair and leaned forward. "And you are," he said, now looking at Dennis the way a man looks at a stain on a carpet he has just noticed. "Dennis Bell, I clean this floor." Richard let a small, tired smile work across his face. "I have a degree from Wharton, Mr. Bell. I have 30 years in this industry. I have tonight 3 audit partners and 2 attorneys who all reached the same conclusion." He gestured vaguely at the paper in Dennis's hand. "And you have—" "I have eyes." Richard's smile went a little tighter. He turned to Elena. "With the greatest respect, Elena. We announced this at 6 o'clock. The filing is due at the courthouse at 9. I will not let the last 12 hours of this company's life be spent on—" He looked back at Dennis for half a breath. A janitor who read something off a table. Where did you get this paper, Mr. Bell? The attorney spoke for the first time, her voice mild but careful. You do understand that internal documents are not supposed to leave this room. Dennis did not answer right away. He slid the paper across the table toward Richard. It came to rest exactly between them. Richard did not pick it up. I'm calling security back in, he said. No, Elena said. You are not. Elena, give me 3 minutes, Richard. We do not have 3 minutes. Then give me 2. Elena walked the length of the table and sat down in the chair beside Dennis. It was, she realized, with a small and complicated flicker somewhere behind her ribs, the first time any Whitaker had sat beside a custodian at that table since her grandfather had built it. Mr. Bell, tell me what you see, in your own words, not in mine. Dennis looked at her for a moment, then down at the page. When he began to speak, he did not sound like a man defending himself. He sounded like a man explaining a long division problem to a daughter. Ma'am, last Tuesday I emptied recycling on the 32nd floor. Miss Keller's desk, the FX analyst. She prints everything because she reviews with a pen. On top of her bin, there was a weekly hedge summary for Whitaker Europe. The top line was the same trade that is on this page right here. Except on her sheet, that trade was a $34.2 million gain, not a loss. He turned the page over and laid his index finger on a line near the top. I remembered because the number was round. 34.2. And she had put a yellow sticky note on it. 3 words underlined twice. Best trade ever. A person does not write that on a loss. He turned the page again to page 47. And then it shows up here. Same trade. Whitaker Europe FX hedge. $34.2 million loss. On 2 different pages of the same report. Both the same direction. Both the wrong direction if Miss Keller's sheet was right. He lifted his hand off the page. That is $68 million, ma'am. $68 million that either is not there or is there twice. Either way, somebody's math is wrong. The room held very still. Richard let out a small laugh with no humor in it. A sticky note, he said. Elena, are we running this company on sticky notes now? Elena did not look at him. She was looking at the page. Richard, pull the original from Frankfurt. It is 5 in the morning there. Then wake somebody up. Richard stared at her. For a moment, his face did something it rarely did in public. It showed its age. He was a man who had built an entire career on the fact that nobody above him had ever asked him to defend his math. He was about to be asked. Elena, he said quietly, if you do this and he is wrong, this story gets worse, not better. You do understand that. I understand that, Richard. And if he is right, she did not answer. She did not need to. Richard picked up his phone and walked to the far corner of the boardroom. The next 4 hours belonged to the phones. By 10:30, Elena had a skeleton crew assembled on the 47th floor. A junior analyst named Jordan Pierce, who had been home for exactly 19 minutes before the call came and had returned with his hair still wet. A systems administrator from IT who brought up the closed ledger software on a laptop he was not supposed to be able to open after hours. The restructuring attorney who stayed because her firm's fee was going to look very different if the filing did not happen. Richard who stayed because he had no choice. Dennis stayed because Elena told him to. He sat at the far end of the table with a paper cup of coffee somebody had handed him without a word. He did not drink it. He watched Jordan scroll through the consolidation ledger, and he watched the ledger scroll, and every few minutes he pointed at a line and said quietly, There. The first 2 times Jordan looked up with the flat, guarded patience young analysts use on men they have already decided not to take seriously. The 3rd time the young man said under his breath, How did you see that? I read this stuff in the break room, Dennis said. At 12:17 in the morning, Elena's phone buzzed with a Bloomberg alert. Tokyo had been bleeding for more than 5 hours. Whitaker Capital's American depository receipts were down 41% on the overnight tape. Her phone buzzed again 30 seconds later. Hong Kong, same story. She set the phone face down on the table. A minute later, it buzzed a 3rd time. She turned it over. The head of her institutional client desk had sent 6 words. They are calling. All of them. She set the phone face down again. Richard watched her do it. His face had the hoarse flatness of a man whose life had just begun to come apart at the seams and who was trying out of long professional habit not to show it. He had not left the room since 1 o'clock. He had not made a single joke. He had not since Elena's last instruction told her that she was wrong. That more than anything else, told her how afraid he had become. At 1:32, the Frankfurt office finally answered the secure line. The head of Whitaker Europe was in his car, driving back to the office in pajama pants under his coat. He pulled the original hedge confirmation from the counterparty bank and read the number into the speakerphone. $34.2 million credit gain booked on the 12th of September. The counterparty is Deutsche Bank Frankfurt. The confirmation has a wet signature. I am looking at the wet signature right now. The boardroom exhaled as a single room. That is one side of it, Richard said. He was not conceding anything. He was thinking out loud, which was for Richard Moreau already a kind of concession. We still have to prove the double count on the U.S. consolidation. The audit firm is going to want a clean trail. And if we take this to the courthouse at 9 and we cannot walk them line by line, then we will build them a clean trail, Elena said. In 6.5 hours. In 6.5 hours. At 2:14, Dennis stood up. Ma'am, if I may. She looked at him. There is a room downstairs, B2, the recycling holding area. Before the shred truck comes on Thursdays, the paper sits in bins for about 3 days. I keep some of it. Not the confidential stamped stuff. The drafts people throw out, the duplicates, going back about 6 months. Richard's head came up. You have been taking company documents. No, sir. I have been reading what the company threw away before the truck came. Always in the building. Never took any home. Never read anything with a confidential stamp on it. That is still, Richard, Elena said. Later. She looked at Dennis. Go get them. He went. When he came back 20 minutes later, he was pushing a cleaning cart with 4 file boxes stacked on top of it, held down with a cleaning towel so they would not slide. He lifted the boxes onto the table one by one. The top box contained, among other things, 3 separate weekly FX hedge summaries from Whitaker Europe, each showing the same trade, each showing it as a gain. The second box contained a draft consolidation worksheet from 2 weeks ago, with a penciled note in the margin that read, Verify EUR line looks doubled. The note was in Sarah Keller's handwriting. It had been thrown out the next day. Jordan read the note aloud. Nobody spoke. Richard stood up very slowly from his chair. He looked at the 4 boxes. He looked at Dennis. He looked for one long moment that Elena would remember for the rest of her life at his own hands on the table. You are going to bet this entire company, he said, on a man who picks through the trash. Dennis answered without raising his voice. Sir, I do not pick up trash. I pick up what you throw away. Elena heard the sentence the way a person hears a door close in a room she did not know had a door. She did not look at Richard. Jordan. Cross-reference the boxes against the final filing package, every FX line. I want to know line by line where Whitaker Europe numbers came in twice and where they came in once. You have until 5. The young analyst nodded and reached for the first box. 2:47 came and went. 3 o'clock came and went. Somebody Elena never afterward figured out who ordered sandwiches from the only 24-hour place left in the neighborhood, and the smell of mustard and deli paper settled over a room that had spent the last 9 hours smelling like fear. Dennis did not eat. At one point, near 3:15, Elena watched him pull a small photograph from his wallet and look at it for about 4 seconds before putting it back. She did not ask. She did not need to. At 3:18, Richard walked to the window and stood with his back to the room for almost 2 minutes. When he turned around, his tie was loose and his face had the terrible softness of a man who was realizing something about himself that he had managed for 3 decades not to realize. He did not say what it was. Not yet. Jordan set down the last printout at 3:26. He took off his glasses. He rubbed the bridge of his nose with the back of his wrist. He spoke to the ceiling because he could not quite bring himself to speak to Elena. He is right. The Europe hedge ran through the subsidiary ledger correctly as a gain. It got picked up a second time by the U.S. consolidation team. They pulled the same trade from the parent company feed, and somebody flipped the sign during the currency conversion. So the gain became a loss on our side, and then that loss got added on top of a loss that was not supposed to be there at all. He finally looked at Elena. Net impact, once you back it out, the company is not insolvent. Solvent by about $15 million. Thin, but solvent. Nobody in the room moved. Elena did not feel relief. She felt the opposite of relief. She felt the specific airless cold of a person who has just realized how close she came to something she cannot unsee. She opened her laptop. CNBC was still running the banner. Reuters had a live blog going. The Financial Times had a 700-word piece up with 3 named sources. Somewhere in her email, she knew without looking, were the automatic termination notices on 3 of their largest advisory contracts, triggered the moment the Chapter 11 announcement crossed the wire at 6:01. 2 of her board members had already sent resignation letters. A Japanese pension fund had filed suit in the Southern District of New York at 11:41 the previous night. Her phone, still face down on the table, had gone quiet only because it had given up trying to keep up. They had won on the numbers. They had lost on the only thing that had ever mattered in this industry, which was the belief of the people who had given them money. Elena looked down at the Mont Blanc pen still uncapped on the table in front of her. She had been holding it, or looking at it, for almost 6 hours, without signing anything. "Numbers do not lie," she said to nobody in particular. "But people who read numbers wrong still do." The words came out of her mouth in her father's cadence. She had not meant them to. She turned toward the far end of the table. "Mr. Bell." He looked up. "Why did you do this?" He did not answer right away. He looked at her with the kind of expression a man wears when he has been asked a question he was not sure anybody would ever ask him, and he is trying to decide whether to answer it honestly or politely. He chose honestly. He reached into the breast pocket of his uniform shirt and took out a folded piece of lined paper. He unfolded it carefully the way a man unfolds a thing he has unfolded many times and slid it across the table toward Elena. 10 long division problems in a child's hand in green marker. At the top of the page in the same green marker. "For Daddy, check my math, please." "Ma'am, about 6 hours ago, I told my 8-year-old daughter that she should always check every number. Even when everybody tells her she is right, especially then." He lifted his eyes to meet hers. "I could not tell her that, and then walk out of this room tonight." Elena looked at the paper for a long moment. She turned her face toward the dark windows over the lake, and then for the first time in 3 years in this building, she put her hand up to cover her mouth and kept it there. When she brought it down again, there was a single wet line along the side of her index finger that she did not try to hide. Richard saw it. He did not say anything. He sat down very slowly in his chair. The sandwiches were cold. The coffee was cold. Outside, Chicago was still black, but somewhere under the black, the first edge of gray had begun to work its way up from the lake. 3:32 in the morning. 5.5 hours until the filing deadline that was no longer going to be met, and 5 hours until the market opened on a story that had already been told. They had the truth now. They just did not, Elena understood, have anybody left who would believe it. At 3:41 in the morning, Elena walked out of the boardroom and stood alone in the hallway for a long time. The hallway was a place she had walked past without seeing every working day for the 11 years since her father had moved his own office down the hall to make room for hers. She saw it now. The portraits along the wall, 9 of them going back to the 1970s, were all of men who had sat where she had sat tonight. None of them were of women. None of them were of anybody who had ever pushed a cleaning cart through this building at 2 in the morning. She had walked past those portraits every day of her adult working life, and she had never once asked herself who was missing from them. The truth she had reached was larger than a number. Dennis Bell had walked through every floor of this building for 6 years. He had seen the FX desk, the consolidation team, and the boardroom. He was the only person in the company whose routine crossed all 3, and in 6 years, nobody had ever asked him what he saw. There had been no meeting he was invited to. There had been no inbox he could write to. There had been no mechanism anywhere in the 63-page compliance manual Elena had helped draft for a man in a blue uniform to tell a woman in a corner office that her math was wrong. If he had gone home tired tonight, the way he had every other night, the company her father had built would have died at 9 in the morning because of a sign error a tired analyst had made on a Tuesday afternoon 6 weeks ago. Her father had taught her that numbers did not lie. He had been right about that. What he had not taught her, because it had not yet been his turn to learn it, was that a system was only as strong as the weakest person who was allowed to speak inside it. She walked back into the boardroom at 4:02. Richard was still in his chair. He looked up at her the way a man looks up when he already knows what is going to be said and is only waiting to hear it in somebody else's voice. "Richard, go home. Get 2 hours. Be back here at 6. Elena, I am not firing you tonight. If I were firing you tonight, I would do it tonight. Go home." He nodded. He stood up. At the door, he turned around as though to say something and then did not. He left. The restructuring attorney was already packing her portfolio. The IT administrator had fallen asleep sitting up in his chair. Jordan was staring at a page of his own handwriting with the slightly dazed expression of a young man who had lived through the longest night of his life without noticing until it was almost over. Elena sent them all home. Only Dennis remained sitting at the far end of the table with a cold cup of coffee he had never drunk. She walked down the length of the room and sat across from him again. "Mr. Bell." "Ma'am." "In about 2.5 hours, I am going to stand in front of a camera, and I am going to tell the world that we almost killed this company over a mistake that we made, and that the person who caught it was a janitor who was not supposed to be in the conversation." He looked at her and waited. "I am going to use your name." His face did something small and private, and then it settled. "If that is all right with you," she added. "Ma'am, my name is the only part of this I have not been ashamed of tonight. You can use it." She nodded once. She was not yet able to say thank you in the shape that word deserved. She would learn later how to say it. For tonight, the nod was what she had. At 6:29, she walked into the lobby press room on the ground floor of the building. She had not gone home. She had not changed her clothes. Her hair was pulled back with a rubber band somebody had given her from a drawer in the executive kitchen because she had not been able to find the clip she had worn the night before. There was no script. There were no prepared remarks. The communications director had tried 3 separate times in the last hour to put a sheet of talking points in her hand. She had set it back down each time. She stepped up to the small lectern in front of the company's seal. 6 cameras were on. She could see in the monitor at the back of the room her own face, tired, older than she had looked yesterday, and somehow more like her father than she had ever looked in her life. She did not begin with good morning. "Last night, this company came within 40 minutes of filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. It would have been the wrong filing for the wrong reason based on a $68 million error that nobody in this building's finance department, myself included, had caught. We announced that filing at 6 o'clock yesterday evening. I am here at 6:30 this morning to tell you that the announcement was a mistake. This company is solvent, thinly, but solvent." A murmur moved through the cameras. She kept going. "The error was not caught by our chief financial officer. It was not caught by our auditors. It was not caught by our restructuring council or our board of directors. It was caught by a man named Dennis Bell, who cleans the 47th floor of this building at night and who saw a number on a document and recognized from his own reading that the same trade had been booked on the wrong side of the ledger twice. He stopped me in this building at 9:47 last night, and he said, and I quote him exactly, 'You missed this number.' He was right. And he risked his job to say it because until last night this company did not have a way for a man in his position to be heard any other way." She looked up from the lectern. "I am going to take questions in a moment. Before I do, I want to say one thing, and I want it to be on every recording in this room. The mistake was ours. The save was his. The lesson is mine." The cameras kept rolling. By the time she stepped down from the lectern, the American depository receipts that had cratered overnight had already begun a slow, skeptical climb on the pre-market tape in New York. The stock would finish the day up 61% off the overnight low, not whole, not healed, but alive. Two of the advisory contracts that had auto-terminated at 6:01 the night before would be renegotiated within the month. The Japanese pension fund's suit would be withdrawn in 6 weeks quietly without a settlement. Richard Moreau did not come back at 6. He came back at 7:30 in a fresh shirt and asked for 20 minutes of her time. In her office with the door closed, he did not make a speech. He sat in the chair across from her desk and looked at his own hands for almost a full minute before he spoke. "Elena, I do not think I should stay." "Richard, let me finish. I have sat in rooms like the one we were in last night for 30 years, and somewhere in those 30 years I stopped hearing anyone who did not speak the way I speak. I did not do it on purpose. That I think is what is actually wrong with it." He met her eyes for the first time since he had come in. "I would not have listened to him. If you had not been in that room, I would have called security, and the man who saved this company would have been walked out of this building in handcuffs. I have thought about that for the last 4 hours. I do not know how to be the chief financial officer of a company where the chief executive has to protect the company from me." She did not argue with him. She did not try to. He resigned on paper that afternoon. The resignation letter was gracious. It did not mention Dennis by name. It did not need to. In the weeks that followed, Elena announced 2 changes. The first was a lateral reporting channel. Any employee of Whitaker Capital at any level in any office could submit a data observation, anything from a number that looked off to a process that did not make sense, directly to a small independent committee that reported not to the CFO, not to the CEO, but to the audit committee of the board. Every submission would receive a written response within 48 hours. The person who submitted it would be told by name which partner on the committee had reviewed it and what had been done. The second was a new position: Internal Observation Analyst. It had not existed before. It did not exist anywhere else in the industry. The job description was simple: walk the floors, read across silos, notice what nobody in any one department was in a position to notice, report up. She offered the position to Dennis 2 weeks after the night of the boardroom. He sat in her office in the same chair Richard had resigned in, and he looked at the written offer for a long time before he answered. "Ma'am, I appreciate this. I do. But I do not have the degree." "I know. I was 1 semester short 12 years ago. I have not been in a classroom since." "I know that, too." She slid a second sheet of paper across the desk. "The company will pay the tuition. Full ride. Part-time evenings, whatever schedule fits your daughter's school year. You finish the accounting degree on our time and our money. In the meantime, you take the position. You do the job. The credential is not a condition of doing the work. We learned that in this building at a cost of $68 million. Dennis looked at the second sheet for a long time. When he looked up, his eyes were wet, but his voice was perfectly steady. "I would like to think about it. Just overnight, ma'am. I need to tell my daughter before I say yes to anything." "Mr. Bell, you can take all the overnights you need." On a Saturday afternoon, 2 weeks after that, Elena drove herself her usual car service sent home for the day to a second-floor walk-up apartment in a quiet block on the south side. She carried a bakery box with a ribbon on it. She had called ahead. She had asked the way a person who was still learning how to ask asks whether it would be all right to come. A small girl with her hair in 2 braids opened the door and looked up at Elena with grave, serious eyes. "You are the lady from my dad's television?" "I am." "You must be Zoe." "I am. I brought cookies. I was told they are your favorite kind. I was told this by a reliable source." Zoe nodded solemnly. "Dad is a reliable source." Dennis appeared at the doorway behind his daughter in a plain gray sweater and jeans, smiling the smile of a man who was still getting used to being a man who welcomed the CEO into his living room. His mother sat in a chair in the corner with a pair of knitting needles and a half-finished blanket across her knees. She nodded warmly when Elena came in. She did not get up. Elena understood somehow that this was the correct version of welcome in this house, and she appreciated it very much. They sat at the kitchen table. Dennis made coffee, real coffee, not the burnt kind, from the break room. Zoe sat across from Elena with her long division workbook open on the table between them because Dennis had evidently warned her that the television lady had asked to see it. "Show me the famous one," Elena said. Zoe flipped pages until she found it. She turned the book around and pushed it across the table with one finger. "Number 6, Zoe said. "I had it wrong the first time. Dad made me check every step. I had carried the wrong number." Elena looked at the page for a long time. Then she reached into her handbag and took out a dark lacquered pen with a small white star on the cap. She set it on the table in front of the girl. "Zoe, this was my father's pen. He gave it to me a long time ago on the day I finished a very hard school. I have used it for 20 years to sign papers I thought were right. Some of them were. But 3 weeks ago I almost used it to sign a paper that was wrong because I had forgotten to check every step the way your father taught you. You learned that lesson when you were 8. I am 42, and I am only now learning it. The pen belongs with somebody who already knows how to use it." Zoe looked at her father. Dennis looked at the pen and at his daughter and at Elena, and his eyes did something they had not done in a long time. He nodded once. Zoe picked the pen up with both hands. It was much too big for her fingers. She held it the way a person holds something she is going to grow into. "Thank you, ma'am." "Thank you, Miss Bell." 3 months later, Dennis walked into the lobby of the Whitaker Capitol building at 8 in the morning through the employee entrance. He had been offered a pass for the main lobby. He had not taken it. He said good morning to the security guard who had on a different night almost walked him out of the building in front of the chief financial officer, and the guard, a man named Dwight, reached out and shook his hand, something the two men had begun to do quietly most mornings without ever discussing why. In the service corridor, he passed Ray, who was still on the night shift and was pushing a cart toward the freight elevator at the end of his rounds. Ray stopped and grinned. "Mr. Numbers himself?" Ray said. Dennis laughed the first easy laugh of his morning. "You still reading trash? Only the interesting kind." The two men clasped shoulders briefly and moved on in opposite directions. In the elevator, a young woman in a blazer who did not recognize him glanced at his laminated badge and then at his face. "I am new here," she said. "What do you do at the company?" Dennis smiled. "I check the numbers." 2 floors above them, in a corner office facing the lake, Elena was signing a routine expense authorization with a plain ballpoint pen from a cup on her desk. The Mont Blanc had been gone from her pocket for 3 months, and she had not, to her own considerable surprise, missed it once. She looked up through the glass wall of her office as Dennis passed on his way to the analyst pool, a folder of reports under one arm. He saw her. She saw him. They nodded once across the glass the way 2 people nod when the words have already been said, and there is no need to say them again. Then the workday began. That is where this story ends, on the 47th floor of a building that almost became a footnote on a morning that almost never came. But if you listen closely, there is one more thing it wants to tell you before it lets you go. Every company has a Dennis. Every classroom has one. Every hospital, every city council, every family dinner table. Somebody in the room who sees something nobody else sees and who spends most of their life deciding whether it is worth the risk to say it out loud. And every company, every classroom, every family has an Elena too. Somebody with a pen in her hand, with the weight on her shoulders, with a voice in her head telling her that the smart people have already agreed, so please just sign. The truth of tonight's story is not that one of them was a hero. The truth is that both of them had to be brave on the same night in the same room at the same table. Dennis had to be brave enough to speak when the room was not built to hear him. Elena had to be brave enough to listen when the room was telling her not to. If you have ever been the person holding the paper that nobody wanted to look at, I would love to hear about it. Tell me in the comments below, when was the moment you spoke up and what did it cost you? And if you have ever been the person with the pen, the one who almost missed something because the room was too loud with the right kind of voices, tell me that story too. I read every comment. Those are the ones that keep me up at night in the best way. If this story stayed with you, like, helps more people find it, and a subscribe keeps us together for the next one. If someone comes to mind while you are watching somebody who needs permission to speak or permission to listen, send this their way. You never know whose 47th floor they are standing on tonight. Take care of each other, always check the numbers, and remember, the truth does not care where you stand in the room. It only cares whether you are brave enough to say it and whether somebody in the room is brave enough to hear it. Good night. I will see you in the next one.